Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Evening was falling on Manhattan, and the lights of Broadway illuminated the city like an ocean of stars. In this effervescent setting stood one of the most prestigious restaurants in New York, the Golden Oak. Its majestic entrance, marble columns, and large bay windows made it a symbol of luxury, where only the most fortunate and influential dared to cross the threshold. Inside, every detail exuded opulence: the crisply pressed white tablecloths, the crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow, and the discreet orchestra playing soft jazz in the background. The guests wore gala attire, their conversations intertwined in a worldly symphony where money and power were the true masters of ceremonies. Among the waiters in black and white uniforms, a young woman stood out with her discreet presence, Amara Johnson, 26 years old, with a slender figure, hair neatly tied in a simple bun, and a deep gaze that betrayed both determination and fatigue. She wasn't like the other employees. Behind her polite smiles and measured gestures, Amara hid a brilliant mind. Since her childhood in the Bronx, she had been passionate about languages. Worn books, dictionaries borrowed from the library, and long nights of study had allowed her to become fluent English, French, Spanish, Italian and German. Yet this talent remained in the shadows. The world she worked in didn't seek to see beyond her uniform. To most customers, she was just another black waitress, invisible amid the gilt and hushed laughter. That evening, the room was buzzing with excitement. A private banquet was bringing together New York businessmen, European diplomats, and a few political figures. Among them was Richard Coleman, the manager of the Golden Oak. Tall, arrogant, in his 50s, with an expensive suit, cold gaze, and a predatory smile. He considered himself the undisputed master of the place, and liked to remind his employees that they owed him obedience and respect. But behind his veneer of respectability, Coleman was a man with a deep sense of contempt, especially for those he deemed inferior. When Amara approached to present him with the menu, Coleman looked up at her, a mocking smile on his lips. Around him, his guests laughed and drank champagne, listening attentively to his every word. "Tell me, Miss Johnson, you who serve so well, are you as intelligent as you appear?" he shouted loudly. Amara, destabilized by the question, remained frozen, the menu clutched between her fingers. Coleman sneered and grabbed a card written in Italian. He held it up in front of everyone, like a trophy meant to humiliate. "If you're so smart, translate it," he said, emphasizing each word with cruel pleasure. A heavy silence fell, followed by stifled laughter among some of the guests. Amara felt her heart race. She knew the language perfectly, but the weight of the others' stares prevented her from reacting. Should she give in to the provocation? Should she reveal her secret in front of everyone? Coleman, satisfied with his little show, placed the menu on the table and picked up his champagne. As far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. He had just reminded everyone that, despite her distinguished airs, Amara was just a waitress who needed to be obeyed. But what Coleman didn't know was that this humiliation would be the beginning of his downfall. Because Amara wasn't just an employee, she was also the granddaughter of Henry Whitmore, the wealthy owner of the Golden Oak, an influential man whose gaze even the most powerful feared. And soon, this truth would come to light. That evening, amidst the scent of vintage wine and the clinking of crystal glasses, a silent war had begun, that of pride against intelligence, of contempt against dignity. Amara remained motionless for a few seconds after the public humiliation. The Italian menu still lay on the white tablecloth, as if demonstrating Coleman's contempt. Her hands trembled slightly, but she managed to maintain a mask of neutrality. She knew that in this place, the slightest reaction could be interpreted as insubordination. Around her, the laughter had died down, replaced by a heavy unease. Some customers looked away, embarrassed by the manager's brutality, while others, afraid of losing their privileges, preferred to smile knowingly. Coleman, satisfied, raised his cup. "That's what I call professionalism," he said ironically, as if he had just given a lesson to a recalcitrant student. Amara took a deep breath. Her chest tightened, but her eyes showed nothing. She simply nodded, as if this scene were just an incident. Yet, Deep inside her, a burning sensation was growing. An inner voice kept repeating, "You should have answered. You could have silenced him." She stepped away from the table with dignity, holding her tray against her like a shield. In the hallway leading to the kitchen, she felt a hand gently rest on her arm. It was Martha Lopez, another older waitress, who had worked at the Golden Oak for 10 years. Her maternal gaze betrayed the anger she contained. "Don't take it to heart, my daughter. Coleman is a bitter man. He always picks on younger people, especially us women of color." Amara gave a sad smile. "It's okay, Martha. I'm used to it." But the truth was, she wasn't used to it. Every humiliation, every hurtful remark, added like a stone to an invisible burden she'd been carrying for years. In the kitchen, the other servers whispered. Some silently pitied her, others preferred to keep their distance, fearing to be associated with her. Amara put down her tray and stepped away for a few moments, seeking refuge in the small corridor leading to the back of the restaurant. She closed her eyes and let out a shaky sigh. In her mind, the Italian words flowed effortlessly, the sentences forming naturally. She could have translated the menu in a heartbeat. She could have dismissed the manager for his ignorance. But she chose silence. Not out of weakness. By strategy. She knew the moment would come. Coleman thought he had won a battle, but he didn't know he had already started a war he couldn't control. So Amara squared her shoulders, picked up her tray, and returned to the room. Her gait was calm, controlled, almost regal. She would not be the eternal victim. Tonight marked the beginning of a change none of them could have foreseen. When Amara returned to the great hall, the banquet was in full swing. Crystal glasses clinked, fine dishes followed one another, and conversations resumed as if nothing had happened. Yet beneath this facade of worldliness, a lingering unease hung in the air. At Coleman's table, some guests exchanged meaningful glances. Among them, an elegant man with a thin mustache was watching Amara with particular attention. It was Alessandro Moretti, an Italian diplomat stationed in New York. His eyes shone with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. He leaned slightly towards his neighbor, a French ambassador, and whispered. "That director wanted to humiliate her, but I saw her eyes. She understood Italian perfectly. She chose to remain silent." The ambassador raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Do you believe it?" "I'm sure of it." Meanwhile, Amara, focused on her service, carefully avoided Coleman's gaze. But she felt the whispers, the discreet glances that followed her. Some customers had perceived her restraint not as weakness, but as a silent strength. At the end of the room, in a more discreet corner, David Harris, a young black lawyer invited by one of the diplomats, was also observing the scene. The son of teachers and a quiet activist for equal rights, he knew this type of humiliation all too well. Seeing Amara, he clenched his fists under the table. This is another example of their contempt, he thought. But what surprised him was the dignity with which the young woman had taken the attack. Suddenly, Coleman, drunk on his own power, decided to add another layer. He raised his voice to cover the music of the orchestra. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must admit that the staff here are doing their best. But, sometimes they need to be reminded of their limits." A hearty laugh escaped his lips. A few guests laughed politely, but others looked down uncomfortably. Amara, who was passing by with a carafe of wine, felt her cheeks burn. She forced herself to breathe slowly, carefully setting the bottle down. But as she walked away, a soft voice stopped her. "Miss," said Alessandro Moretti in Italy, "could you recommend a dish for me tonight?" Silence fell again. Coleman whipped his head around, ready to savor another humiliation. But Amara, without blinking, simply smiled politely, and remained silent. She bowed slightly, then, with a gracious gesture, invited the diplomat to consult the menu. She still refused to reveal her secret. Coleman burst out laughing, believing this to be confirmation of his judgment. "You see? Even when we talk to her, she doesn't understand." But Moretti frowned. He had seen the sparkle in Amara's eyes, that look that clearly said, "I understand," but I choose to remain silent." And in the hushed murmurs of the room, a truth began to circulate: perhaps the humiliated waitress was not who they thought she was. The night stretched on, and the lights of Manhattan flickered like 1,000 unattainable promises. After her shift, Amara returned to her small apartment in the Bronx. The streets were darker, the sidewalks cracked, and the smell of fried food from the neighborhood shops hung in the air. Here, no one wore expensive suits or designer dresses. Here, people survived. Amara pushed open the door to her apartment on the third floor of a dilapidated building. The walls were dull, the paint peeling, but inside there was a modest warmth. On the living room table, language textbooks were piled high alongside a dog-eared Italian dictionary and a notebook covered in handwritten notes. She took off her coat, poured her mother a cup of tea. Deborah Johnson, lying on the couch. The illness had been weakening her for several years, and Amara worked tirelessly to pay for her care. "How was your day, darling?" Deborah asked, her voice soft but tired. "Like all the others, Mom," Amara replied, forcing a smile. She didn't want to worry her mother about the humiliation she had suffered. So she changed the subject, asking if she had taken her medication. After watching over her, Amara retreated to her room. There, she opened a worn notebook filled with vocabulary lists, translated sentences, and quotes that she tirelessly copied. She began rereading texts in German, then in Italian, correcting her intonation in a low voice. Her pronunciation was perfect. Foreign words danced on her tongue like second nature. Learning languages had always been a refuge for her, a way to escape contempt, condescending looks, poverty. Each new word was a victory against the fate that seemed to want to limit her. Sitting at her desk, she thought back to her childhood. At the time, she had received a partial scholarship to Columbia University. Her professors described her as a brilliant student, destined for a career as a linguist or international interpreter. But her mother's medical bills, lack of money, and nights spent working odd jobs had all put paid to her dreams. She had to drop out of school. Yet she never stopped learning. Even in the shadows. She grabbed a photo from her desk. In it, an elegant man in his 60s stood beside her at a family dinner. His neatly styled gray hair, his simple but refined suit, and his kind smile made him seem almost fatherly. He was Henry Whitmore, his maternal uncle. Few people knew that this restaurant magnate owned the Golden Oak and several luxury establishments across the country. Henry had always believed in her. But Amara had insisted. She wanted to join Golden Oak as a simple employee, without favoritism, to understand the system from the inside and climb the ladder on her own merit. Running her fingertips along the frame of the photo, she whispered, "Uncle, I think the time is approaching." Her eyes fell on the Italian dictionary lying open in front of her. The words seemed to glow under the desk lamp. She remembered Coleman's arrogance, his laughter, his contemptuous look. She could have destroyed him with a single sentence. But no. She had chosen silence. Because a well-placed silence was sometimes worth more than 1,000 words. That night, Amara made a promise to herself. The day Coleman tried to humiliate her again, she would no longer remain silent. She would prove to everyone that she was not just an invisible waitress, but a cultured, strong woman, and far more influential than they could ever imagine. And deep down, she knew that day would come sooner than she thought. A few days later, excitement reached the Golden Oak. It hadn't been this busy for years. That evening, the restaurant was scheduled to host a diplomatic banquet organized in honor of a delegation from Europe. Ambassadors, businessmen and political representatives had gathered. The kitchens were in full swing, chefs were bustling about, commis staff were running from one end to the other, and waiters were adjusting their immaculate uniforms. The smell of roasted salmon, brioche bread, and herb sauces hung in the air. Amara stood in front of the mirror in the staff locker room, smoothing down her black apron and adjusting her hair. Her heart was beating faster than usual. She felt this evening would be like no other. Her instincts, honed by years of silent observation, whispered that something was about to happen. In the great hall, everything shone. The white tablecloth seemed to sparkle beneath the crystal chandeliers, and the champagne glasses reflected the light like tiny stars. The guests arrived one by one, escorted by their bodyguards and greeted with fixed smiles. The first to enter was Alessandro Moretti, the Italian diplomat, accompanied by his wife. His eyes instinctively sought Amara as soon as he walked through the door. When he saw her, a discreet smile crossed his face. He hadn't forgotten the scene from the other evening, nor the young waitress's eloquent silence. Then came the French ambassador, Pierre Delacroix, tall, slim, with elegant gestures. Behind him, a German representative, Klaus Reinhardt, imposing and severe, shook the hand of each guest with almost military professionalism. Finally, Coleman entered, like a general inspecting his army. His midnight blue three-piece suit gleamed under the lights, and his expensive perfume wafted around him. He shook hands, cracked jokes, and played the perfect host. But his arrogant eyes were already searching for the slightest opportunity to shine at the expense of his subordinates. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Golden Oak, the jewel of New York gastronomy," he proclaimed in a loud voice, attracting everyone's attention. Amara, who was pouring the first glasses of wine, met his gaze. She saw that cruel glint in his eyes, the same one from the other night. Coleman hadn't forgotten his little public humiliation, and he was ready to do it again. During the meal, conversations became lively. They discussed international politics, trade, and economic agreements. But a difficulty quickly arose. Reinhardt, the German, complained aloud that he did not understand certain official documents handed out during the banquet. "This text is incomplete, and only in German. Is there anyone here who can explain it to me in English?" he asked in an annoyed tone. Coleman, taken aback, lost his confidence for a moment. His gaze swept the room. Then, suddenly, a wicked smile played on his lips. He turned to Amara, who was passing nearby with a tray. "Well, Miss Johnson, here's a perfect opportunity to prove your intelligence. Translate this passage for our guest." A heavy silence fell. All eyes focused on Amara. She felt her breath catch, but this time she didn't look down. Her fingers gripped the tray so tightly she was afraid she'd make it shake. The diplomats waited. Coleman was already savoring what he believed to be another humiliation. But Amara, deep down, knew that this moment was the one she had been waiting for a long time. And for the first time, she felt that her silence would not last forever. Silence thickened in the luxurious dining room of the Golden Oak. All eyes were fixed on Amara, who still held her tray, motionless as a statue. The crumpled paper in the German ambassador's hands seemed to burn the air around him. Coleman, entrenched in his smugness, crossed his arms, his smirk tugging at his lips. "Come now, Miss Johnson, we're waiting. If you're as competent as some claim, prove it." A few stifled laughs echoed around the table, but Ambassador Reinhardt's gaze was anything but mocking. He stared at Amara with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Amara took a deep breath, carefully placed her tray on a nearby sideboard, and approached the table. She calmly took the document, her eyes quickly glancing over the lines of German. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were weighing each word in her mind. A breath rippled through the room. Then, in a calm, clear voice, she translated into English, without the slightest hesitation. "The article stipulates that the trade agreement will be subject to a 6-month probationary period, after which the terms can be renegotiated." There was complete silence. The guests looked at each other in surprise. Reinhardt frowned, reread the document, then looked up at her. "That's perfectly true," he said seriously. Coleman blinked, unsettled. But before he could regain control, Alessandro Moretti, the Italian diplomat, intervened with a mischievous smile. "Very impressive, Signorina. But tell me, out of curiosity, could you also translate this?" He took a small card written in Italian out of his pocket and handed it to her. Coleman, delighted, thought he saw another opportunity to ridicule her. "Excellent idea, Mr. Moretti. After all, she may claim to know, but does she really know?" Amara took the card, glanced through it quickly and replied immediately, in Italian, with perfect fluency. This message is an official invitation to the gala in Rome next month. The event is intended to strengthen cultural relations between Italy and the United States. Moretti burst into heartfelt laughter and clapped softly. Wonderful. You speak Italian like a native. Murmurs of admiration rippled through the room. Some guests nodded in awe. The French ambassador leaned toward his neighbor and whispered. She's a linguist, not just a waitress. Coleman, his face flushed, clenched his fists under the table. He tried to regain his composure, but the confidence that had accompanied him until then had cracked. Amara, for her part, wasn't smiling. She remained straight, dignified, as if all this were merely a favor rendered. But deep in her eyes shone a new light, the flame of one who knows that the decisive moment has just begun. The entire room was waiting for what would happen next. The atmosphere at the Golden Oak had changed. Where moments earlier, a heavy arrogance had reigned, there was now a palpable, almost admiring curiosity. The guests, drawn from the most influential political and economic spheres, leaned toward Amara as if she had become the centerpiece of the evening. Coleman, meanwhile, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He forced himself to laugh to lighten the mood. Well, that's entertaining. A waitress who improvises as an interpreter, how original. But let's not get distracted, gentlemen. His voice lacked firmness, and everyone noticed. The French ambassador, Mr. Delaunay, gave an amused smile. Let's distract ourselves for a moment then. I'd like to test Miss Johnson, if I may. He took an official document out of his leather briefcase and placed it in front of her. This treaty is written in French. Can you explain its content to our colleagues? Amara took the text, her gaze gliding easily over the paragraphs. In a clear voice, she translated into English, faithfully capturing every diplomatic nuance. The expressions, the idiomatic turns of phrase, everything rang true. Delaunay nodded, impressed. It's impeccable. You have the elegance of a translator trained in our best universities. A murmur of approval went through the table. But that wasn't all. The Japanese ambassador, who had been discreet until then, straightened up and said softly, "If you allow me." He then spoke a long, complex sentence in Japanese, deliberately quickly, as if to test his limits. All eyes turned to Amara. For a brief moment, there was silence, but she responded almost immediately in fluent Japanese, articulating each word with perfect intonation. The Japanese ambassador bowed his head in astonishment. Unbelievable. You speak our language with remarkable precision. At that moment, a voice rang out from the other end of the table. It was a Russian businessman, who had been paying little attention until then, who said, laughing, "And do you know Russian?" Amara turned a calm gaze on him. Then, without hesitation, she answered in Russian, using a typical Moscow idiom. "If you offer me a glass of tea, I will gladly translate it for you." A thunderous burst of applause and laughter shook the room. Even the musicians at the back stopped for a moment, fascinated by what was unfolding before their eyes. Amara, upright and serene, did not seem to be relishing revenge. She carried it out with dignity, as if every word spoken proved both her talent and the injustice of the humiliation she had suffered. Coleman, on the other hand, was sweating profusely. His colleagues were no longer looking at him, but at Amara, as if his authority had been extinguished. He forced a smile, but his clenched jaw betrayed his rage. As the guests were still cheering, Ambassador Reinhardt slowly stood up and said, "Miss Johnson, I only have one question. How did a waitress become fluent in so many languages?" Silence fell again. That was the question everyone was asking. Amara took a breath, looked down for a moment, then looked up again, her pupils shining with determination. "Because I never accepted being told where I belonged." A shudder ran through the room. Some nodded in respect. Coleman, however, felt the noose tighten, his public humiliation had just begun. Coleman stared at Amara with a mixture of rage and disbelief. His entire plan, to humiliate a black waitress to entertain his guests, had backfired. Worse yet, she had just stolen the spotlight in his own domain, authority over this room. The guests, now captivated by Amara, paid her almost no attention. Even Ambassador Reinhardt, a man known for being cold and difficult to impress, watched her with respect. Coleman cleared his throat and spoke again firmly, trying to regain his composure. "Very good, Miss Johnson. You can say a few sentences in several languages. Impressive for a waitress, but that doesn't make you an expert." A few heads turned towards him, surprised by his abruptness. But Coleman continued, determined to break up what he called his little show. After all, reciting ready-made formulas is within the reach of anyone who has learned them by heart. But a true linguist, a true intellectual, also knows how to translate complex ideas, nuances, philosophical concepts. He bent down, opened his briefcase, and took out a thick book, a philosophical essay in Latin. He almost threw it onto the table, startling some of the guests. "If you are as brilliant as you claim to be, translate this in front of all of us." A tense silence fell. Several guests exchanged disapproving glances. The French ambassador, Delaunay, frowned. "Mr. Coleman, isn't this excessive?" But Coleman shook his head. "Not at all. We must distinguish between the show of a waitress who impresses and true knowledge." Amara looked at the book in front of her. Her hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear, but from anger. She recognized the gesture as a trap, an attempt to trick her into making a mistake in front of everyone. She picked up the book, opened it to the page Coleman indicated, and scanned the lines written in Latin. The familiar symbols, learned over long nights spent in the university libraries she secretly frequented, came back to her. Then, calmly, she translated. "The wise man is not measured by the wealth he accumulates, but by the dignity he maintains when faced with adversity." The room remained silent for a few seconds. What she had just read resonated strangely with the current situation. Coleman, pale, opened his mouth but no words came out. Then the Japanese ambassador burst into a low chuckle, followed by Moretti, then Reinhardt. Soon, the entire room was applauding Amara again, but this time with even greater intensity. Amara, however, didn't look up. She remained calm, even though her heart was pounding. She knew Coleman hadn't said his last word. And indeed, behind his tight smile, Coleman was already planning a new strategy. He couldn't lose face tonight, not in front of so many influential witnesses. Coleman, flushed with anger but determined not to lose face, leaned slightly toward the room, as if to remind everyone who held authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that some people may be impressed by mere academic talent. But true professionalism is measured by how you handle real-life responsibilities here in this restaurant." He glared at Amara, ready to humiliate her further. But at that precise moment, the large front door opened with a soft metallic click. An elegant man in his 60s entered. His suit was perfectly tailored, his gait confident, his silver hair impeccable. The entire room froze for a moment, and even Coleman turned his head, intrigued and suddenly nervous. "Henry Whitmore," someone whispered. The man stepped forward, waving his hand to the guests. He stopped in front of the central table, his pale blue gaze fixed on Amara. A calm, knowing smile played on his lips. "Good evening everyone," he said in a calm and firm voice. "I see the party is in full swing." Coleman felt his muscles tense. He recognized the name immediately, but more importantly, he understood this man's position, the true owner of the Golden Oak. The man he depended on and feared. Henry Whitmore leaned slightly towards Amara and whispered, "Well done, my niece." Amara gave a small smile. She knew this support would change the dynamic in the room. Whitmore straightened up and addressed everyone. "I would like to introduce Miss Amara Johnson. She's not just a waitress here, she's my niece. And she's trained at the best schools to become a professional interpreter and linguist." A murmur ran through the room. The guests exchanged surprised glances, some shocked. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Coleman, pale, tried to regain his composure. "Is this a joke?" "No way," Whitmore replied calmly. If Amara chose to work here as a simple waitress, it was to understand the reality on the ground. She wanted to observe, learn and excel on her own merits. The room erupted in applause. Amara, standing tall and dignified, felt the pressure ease. For the first time, she was no longer alone in the face of hatred or arrogance. Coleman, his fists clenched, muttered under his breath. "It's not possible." But it was clear to everyone at the table that the game had shifted. The arrogant director was no longer the center of attention. Amara, with her talent and dignity, had taken over. Whitmore, watching the scene, whispered to Amara, "Be patient. Good things come to those who wait." Amara nodded. She knew this was only the beginning. Coleman would continue to look for loopholes, but now she had an asset no one could challenge, the support of the most powerful man in Golden Oak. After Henry Whitmore's triumphant entrance, the tension in the room hadn't abated. Coleman, pale, looked around at each of the guests, aware that his authority had just been shattered. Every smile, every admiring glance turned toward Amara was a cruel reminder of his defeat. Whitmore stepped to the center of the room, his gaze fixed on Coleman. "Richard," he said calmly but firmly, "I think it's time everyone understood one thing." Coleman opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Whitmore continued. "Amara Johnson isn't just a waitress. She has a degree in linguistics, speaks 6 languages fluently, and has trained at top institutions to become an international interpreter." A murmur rippled through the room. Some diners leaned forward to check if anyone was joking. Others, open-mouthed, stared at Amara with a mixture of respect and admiration. Amara, upright and calm, gave a slight smile. She felt victory approaching, but remained measured. She knew Coleman might still try one last shot. Whitmore continua. "It's easy to judge someone by their appearance, their position, or their skin color. But Amara chose to come in here discreetly, to observe and understand. She shows us tonight that talent and dignity always surpass superficiality and arrogance." The guests burst into applause. The previously tense atmosphere transformed into one of collective admiration. Coleman, furious but powerless, tried to protest. "It's not. I mean. Enough, Richard." Whitmore cut in sharply. "Your humiliating attitudes have no place here. You will publicly apologize to Amara, or I will have you removed from this room." Coleman, humiliated in front of all the guests, swallowed his pride with difficulty. He took a step forward, his face red, and articulated with difficulty. I apologize, Miss Johnson, for my behavior, and for any humiliation I have caused you." The room watched in silence. Amara nodded slowly, with dignity. "Thanks," she said calmly, without excessive pride. "I think that's all that was necessary." A shudder ran through the room. For the first time, Coleman was no longer the center of attention. Amara, through her skill, patience, and dignity, had transformed a moment of humiliation into a resounding triumph. Henry Whitmore placed a hand on Amara's shoulder and whispered, "You did what few people would dare to do. And you did it with grace." The guests, captivated by this revelation, could not help but whisper among themselves, some promising to return to the Golden Oak simply to meet the young linguist who had defied arrogance and prejudice. And in Amara's eyes, a glimmer of satisfaction burned. Not only had she defended her dignity, but she had just earned the respect of all those who, just moments before, had underestimated her. Coleman, for his part, remained frozen, aware that his position was irretrievably weakened. The evening that should have been his had turned into a triumph he could never undo. The day after the banquet, the Golden Oak was still reeling from the events of the previous day. The guests had been full of praise for Amara Johnson, and several influential figures had promised to return to meet her personally. Amara, for her part, worked as usual, serving customers with a professional smile, but a new confidence shone in her eyes. She was no longer just another waitress, she had become a symbol of competence and dignity. Coleman, publicly humiliated, tried to compose himself. His colleagues and employees, who had once feared or admired him, now regarded him with a respectful distance, some even with slight contempt. Coleman's every gesture seemed forced, every strained smile betraying his downfall. Henry Whitmore, watching the scene from his adjacent office, smiled slightly. He knew that Amara had not only triumphed over past humiliations, but had earned the respect and admiration of all. "You did exactly what I knew you could do," he whispered to Amara, and with such grace. Amara nodded, her gaze determined but serene. "I didn't just want to prove that I was capable, Uncle. I wanted to show that no one should ever be judged by their appearance or position." Whitmore placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you have succeeded. But this is only the beginning. If you wish, you can now take on real responsibilities at Golden Oak. Not just serve, but lead, advise, influence." Amara felt her heart race. After all these years of silence, hard work, and sacrifice, she had finally crossed a threshold. She was no longer invisible. She had transformed every humiliation into strength, every contemptuous look into opportunity. Coleman, seeing the complicity between Amara and Whitmore, understood that his position at the top had just irrevocably faltered. He had tried to break a young woman, and now he was the one left helpless, watching his empire slip through his fingers. Over the next few weeks, Amara gradually took on more responsibilities. She now coordinated special events, supervised staff, and even advised Whitmore on international matters, using her language skills and insight. And whenever someone mentioned her name, it was with respect and admiration. Customers no longer saw her as a simple waitress, but as a woman capable of transforming the slightest difficulty into triumph. Coleman, meanwhile, had to accept Amara's new hierarchy and recognition. He learned the hard way that arrogance and contempt never get you far when compared to competence and dignity. That evening, as the sun set over Manhattan, Amara paused for a moment by the Golden Oaks floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights twinkle. She took a deep breath and smiled. She had proven something to all those who had underestimated her: true strength lies in knowledge, patience, and the courage to never be crushed by contempt. And now, nothing could stop him.